down here. Okay, we're good then. Okay, so I'd like to introduce Julie. She's a longtime Washington Butterfly Association member. Her personal garden is a certified wildlife habitat and contains over 200 species of native plants. It has been successfully attracting birds, butterflies, pollinators, and beneficial insects for more than 25 years. Her personal garden has been featured in Pacific Horticulture, The Butterfly Gardener, Bird Watching Magazine, and Sunset publications. In 2012 and 2013, the rare Western bumblebee was found in Julie's pollinator garden. She is active in community education outreach. She volunteers for the Washington Native Plant Society, the Washington Butterfly Association, Kruckeberg Botanic Garden, and the National Wildlife Federation. I'm sorry, I'm reading and I'm rushing to not be so late here. The title of Julie's presentation is Native Plants That Feed Birds, Moths, and Butterflies. Thank you so much, Julie, for being with us tonight.
Thanks, Paulette. I'm glad to be here. It's been a little while. And tonight's topic gives an overview of creating garden habitat. First, I'd like to acknowledge that here in Western Washington, many of us live and garden on the lands of the Coast Salish peoples. And I'd like to honor and recognize the relationship that the Coast Salish have with native plants that offer sustenance and connections to cultural traditions. So you know what? We did not yet get my share screen going. So let me do that. Sorry, I should have done that first, you guys. We're rusty. I got distracted. Darren had a lot of interesting things to say. So there we go. Okay. Now, can everyone see that? Can you let me know, Paulette?
Yep, it's good. We're all good.
Okay, you got the PowerPoint going. I'm also going to change my little Zoom so I don't have a line of people there. Okay. All right, so we'll begin with the basics. And there are 5 landscape features that are essential to birds and wildlife. Water that's shallow with sloping sides for access, food in the form of native plants and insects, shelter and nest sites, and sustainable practices that can include reducing lawn, mulching with leaves, and avoiding chemicals. Although beauty isn't essential, it is the feature we most often look for in our gardens. And I hope today you'll see that native plants such as these can add beauty to the landscape while they provide habitat. I'm finding which way it's going to let me advance. Sometimes it's picky. Okay. So the program does follow the stages of our family garden. And you can see there were a few plants when we moved here in 1987. There's a green belt in back, but little grew on the half acre itself. And we really didn't see birds or wildlife other than an occasional crow. And even they didn't stay very long. And take note of this little row of posts. This is the western fence line, and that white shed is behind the tan shed you see in the bottom photo. Okay, so today there are many native plants, a small orchard with fruit trees, blueberries, a small pond, and more. Entomologist Douglas Tallamy tells us that in the United States, we have converted an area 8 times the size of New Jersey into lawn. He further says if we convert half that area back to native plants, over 20 million acres will become available for birds and wildlife. So one of the first things to consider is where to reduce lawn. And to help do that, these books provide a wealth of information. Landscaping for Wildlife by biologist Russell Link with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Attracting Birds and Butterflies by the National Wildlife Federation both cover all aspects of creating garden habitat. And both organizations offer habitat certification, and the garden is certified with both because I like to support their educational programs. For instance, National Wildlife has an Eco Schools program that strives to get youth outdoors and involved with nature. And it's one of the better groups that I know of doing that all across the United States. So it feels good to support the work they're doing. The books at the top were written by Douglas Tallamy, and these books help us understand our connection between our gardens and the wildlife around us. And by using these books, the garden is now a place of abundance. Today, over 70 species of birds visit annually, and 10 species have found a place to nest here. In winter, a red-breasted sapsucker visits. Rufous hummingbirds return in spring. In summer, western tiger swallowtails visit milkweed. Dragonflies live near the pond, and bumblebees find nectar and pollen. So providing habitat for birds benefits other wildlife. Everything living is connected, even more than we realize. With that in mind, we will be looking at host plants for moths and butterflies, followed by a section on hummingbirds, and the second half of the program will be on songbirds. First, I'd like to talk about community wildlife habitats. This program is organized by the National Wildlife Federation, and I'm a volunteer with them. And it works with volunteers to create community wildlife habitats. As you can see, all the way from Bellingham down through the islands, the areas in red are involved. All these areas are involved. The areas in red have met goals that center around educational activities and the number of certified habitats based on population. So this is an older map, and today there would be quite a few broader bands of red communities that have met goals and new areas that are now involved. So if that interests you, check out National Wildlife. So let's start with large native trees like this black cottonwood that, along with big leaf maple, offer nest sites for hawks and owls. At the same time, this egg and caterpillar belong to the western tiger swallowtail. Butterflies lay eggs high in these trees where they're out of reach of most pesticides, unless Bacillus thuringiensis is used. BT is a natural product and may even be labeled as organic, but it is lethal for both moth and butterfly larvae. And our neotropical migrating songbirds use cottonwoods intensively, and they need those insects on the cottonwoods. So everything really is connected, and it's a real problem when we kill even the moth caterpillars. They've had a bad rap over time. People just, that's what BT has been used for. And if you have real problem moths like gypsy moth, I just cut off a branch, and frankly, I really don't have those problems. But when I had young fruit trees, they seemed to be attracted to those. So we would just cut off a branch, bag it up in plastic, and not use any chemicals. So here we see a 3-acre native growth protection area, and this tall, lonely tree is a pretty large black cottonwood. We have some young ones coming out throughout this area. The yellow trees are Pacific willow, and then Douglas fir grow along the top of a steep slope that remains in native vegetation. And this area allows birds to move across the landscape in search of food, mates, and nest sites. And gardens can help connect these areas and extend corridors. Each layer of vegetation supplies habitat that meets the needs of different species. The lines are approximate, and there's plenty of movement between these layers. As gardeners, we have a big effect on the shrub and ground levels. Native willows often grow in these drainage buffers, and they're a host plant for moths and butterflies. So they're a food plant for moth and butterfly caterpillars. And caterpillars and larvae, I'll use those two words interchangeably. They mean the same thing. The branches form a tangled thicket that allows birds to forage safely. Stinging nettles are the food plant for the caterpillars of, let's go from the top, the red admiral, sometimes admirable for bobpile, Satyr anglewing, and Milbert's tortoiseshell all have larvae that feed on stinging nettles. And since moths are approximately 15 times more, not really abundance, but the number of species of moths is approximately 15 times greater than the number of butterflies. And I got that. I didn't take the first figure that came online. I scrolled down to the Xerces website and used their figures and did my own math on it. And it comes out about 15 times on that website. And so this tips the scale toward moth caterpillars as an abundant food source. Hidden on this nettle leaf is a matching moth caterpillar, Hypena californica. The Northwest Stream Center, where this photo was taken, has interpretive signs that make it an excellent place to learn about native plants and the food web while you're outside enjoying nature. Through the work of Douglas Tallamy, we've learned that as many as 96% of birds feed caterpillars to their young. And at least one study has shown that landscapes need to be composed of 70% or more native plants in order to sustain chickadee populations. And you can do your own online search. You can put in native plants and chickadees, and that will bring up some of these studies. Now, to find native plants for caterpillars in our region, I went to Lepidoptera of the Pacific Northwest. And Lepidoptera is the taxonomic order that identifies moths and butterflies as having 4 wings and scales. This book lists host plants and the associated moth caterpillars. So I combined that information with information by Russell Link in Landscaping for Wildlife to create this list. And so you will see numbers in parentheses, and that is the number of species of Lepidoptera using that plant based on this information that I had access to, but it's an approximate number, and new studies are likely to change those numbers. As in other parts of North America, an oak is at the top of the list, and Gary oak is the only oak native to Washington state. Gary oaks have limited range. They're mostly found in the San Juan Islands, prairie lands near Olympia and Tacoma, and parts of the Columbia River Gorge. And they may be in scattered other locations around the state. Oaks need full sun, well-drained soils, and so they won't grow just anywhere. Here they've been planted at Juanita Bay Park, so it will be interesting to see what birds and insects end up coming to these trees as they mature. The rest of the plants on this list are more common. Red alder is underappreciated in its abundance in Western Washington. It recolonizes cleared land, and it takes nitrogen from the atmosphere and transfers it to the soil through specialized root nodules. This improves the soil and helps other plants grow. Russell Link lists and places red alder on his highly recommended list of plants for Lepidoptera. Native willows are way up there on the list of as a host plant, and there are many species of native willows, so it depends on where you live, usually found in wetlands, but as a group, they are valuable host plants. That's followed closely by ocean spray. And then red huckleberry is a smaller shrub that will fit in most garden landscapes. and I will talk about it again later. And I'm going to get my cursor on this list. Hazelnut is can grow as wide as it does tall. So if you plan to grow hazelnut, just be prepared for its potential size. And then Douglas fir, as you know, is a wonderful forest tree, but it needs full sun the first part of its life to get a start. And then we have a nice little grouping here of vine maple, serviceberry, and snowberry. And these three can all be adapted to garden habitat. They're a good size, and the combination will add potential diversity of the moths that might be attracted. Pacific madrone and manzanita can be difficult to grow. They both need full sun and sharply draining soils. Black hawthorn is really I like it as a garden tree, and I'll talk about that again later. Red twig dogwood needs full sun and room to spread. Cascara is a shade tolerant tree of mid-size. Pacific ninebark is an excellent garden shrub. It's large, it's native. And if this list kept going, we would see closely followed by our native cherries and salmonberry and stinging nettles. For folks on the east side, you probably already know this, but you might want to plant bitterbrush and ceanothus. And so the real bottom line here is that the variety of native plants has the potential to increase the abundance and diversity of native insects and Lepidoptera that are attracted. Okay, let's do a visual review. We'll start over here in the upper left. That's red alder, and it's underused as a shade tree. I mean, it truly is not well appreciated. I think it's abundance, but it's a good size for a shade tree, and it grows quickly. Cools the house off in these hot summers. Next, we have a thicket of willows with a common yellow throat, and that's in a wetland nearby. And then ocean spray is spectacular when it flowers, but it can also be quite large on the west side. It'd be a little smaller east of the Cascades where it's drier, and it's fairly scraggly looking. So if you use it in a garden setting, you might not want to make it a focal point, as beautiful as it is when it flowers. Okay, let me go through these a little faster. We have serviceberry, and we'll drop down to cascara, vine maple, big leaf maple, and cottonwood all deserve honorable mention. Now, these insect galls are the work of the thimbleberry gall wasp, and in winter, chickadees feed on the larvae inside these galls. They're pretty unattractive, and in the old days when I tried to have a pretty and neat garden, I probably would have gotten rid of those. But now I know that's bird food. And so I just, try not to notice them too much. Fortunately, my thimbleberry are in a back part of the garden that's fairly natural. And that's the way to grow this plant because it spreads aggressively by root, and it might have too messy a look for most formal gardens. But it's a great plant for the birds and wildlife. Now, it's estimated that 80% of the plants used in landscaping have come from other parts of the world. Plants from other continents are less likely to support Lepidoptera because they haven't evolved together. In contrast, native plants like this bitter cherry, as well as choke cherry, are co-adapted, co-evolved, and codependent with our local insects. And thank you, Stuart. I think he's out there. That's his thought and his quote. And the flowers of our native cherries attract pollinators and hummingbirds. Butterflies use them as a host, and the cherries are eaten by songbirds. So the native cherries are supporting a diversity of wildlife. And so far, we've been looking at plants that grow in large landscapes. And next, we'll look at gardens. So whether it's a hummingbird, a butterfly, a spider making a web, or a ladybug, small habitats can make a difference. I'd like to share a shortened version of David James' story about a monarch butterfly. It starts with a young girl. It starts, with a monarch who was raised by a young girl named Amelia, who lives near Corvallis. Amelia helped tag the monarch before releasing it on August 30th, 2016. 19 days later, the monarch was spotted in San Francisco in a garden on the 4th story of an apartment building. Its tag was photographed while it sipped nectar from lantana and verbena. Amelia's monarch spent 2 hours resting and feeding before it resumed its migration. It had flown 470 air miles, averaging 25 miles per day, and it needed to find food and a safe place to rest, and this apartment garden provided both. So even a patio with flowering plants can be habitat for pollinators. If you'd like to be part of a network of garden habitats, you can visit nationalwildlifenwf.org/certify, and you'll find a checklist of wildlife-friendly landscape practices. And it's a little like casting a vote that shows you support and care about local wildlife. And it connects you with this bigger network. And it's really rewarding. And so I'd encourage you to at least take a look at that. I think a lot of you would say, well, I'm already doing all those things. And you can show support by becoming a certified habitat. I think Barbara was talking about something similar earlier, before we began the program. As a thank you, you'll receive 1 year of National Wildlife Magazine. So whether you have a large garden or a small balcony, hummingbirds are fairly easy to attract. We have 2 species in Western Washington, Rufus and Anna's, and these are both females. And the map shows that hummingbirds are only found in the Americas, the areas in red. In Eastern Washington, you might see Rufus hummingbirds, calliope, and black-chinned hummingbirds. So let's look at these females and their coloration. The Rufus, you can really tell she's got that, I always think of the R for the rusty orange sides and tail feathers, and these wonderful kind of dots, it looks like, on her chin. And then the Anna's is really subtle in color, just kind of a grayish green color. The male Rufus hummingbird has very shiny throat and chin called a gorget, and it reflects these colors wonderfully when it turns its head and catches light. And you can see the male is even more distinctive and orange. And so sometimes people think this is a male, but there's a little bit of color on the females too. And Rufus hummingbirds return to the coastal regions here late March and April. They stay the summer to raise their young, and then they migrate back to Mexico and the southern United States. They are the northernmost nesting hummingbird, as far north as Alaska, close to Anchorage, and they are the farthest migrating. On record is a banded female Rufus, banded in Florida, and captured in a mist net later that season in Anchorage. It's estimated that she had traveled 4,000 miles one way, following mountain ranges and coastlines. Rufus hummingbirds time their arrival in spring to the blossoms of red flowering currant. This is another smaller native shrub for gardens, perhaps even a planter. It doesn't spread by roots, so that's really helpful in a garden setting. Very beautiful, easy to purchase at plant nurseries. Later in summer, there are berries that birds eat. And also flowering at this time is salmonberry. And salmonberry has flowers for nectar, berries, and it offers nest sites. Swainson's thrush have a preference for nesting in dense stands of salmonberry that's found near creeks and streams. It forms a thicket, which is why the birds like it. And when I say those words or anyone says that, that means it's not a garden type of plant unless you have a natural area where you can just let it run rampant, because that's what it will do. It will spread. In May, mock orange comes into bloom. And this Anna's hummingbird spent most of a week feeding on the flowers. And mock orange is a lovely, garden-friendly, fragrant shrub, both sides of the mountains. It's native. Philadelphus lewisii is our native species. But be careful, because sometimes other mock orange from other parts of the country and even Europe may be sold here. And our native plants are also considered to be best adapted for local soil and climate. And so you might keep one eye out for that. And if you want the native, look for the species name lewisii. And I had a friend try planting some mock orange in a school garden, and it wasn't lewisii, and it didn't make it through the winter. So that's an example of where native plants can really be helpful in gardens and do best. So what follows next is Western trumpet honeysuckle. And this is a vigorous vine. It needs fences or trellis for support. I have several plants scattered about the backyard, and it comes alive with hummingbirds when it flowers. It's a very exciting place to be when the Western trumpet honeysuckle blooms. And it has berries later on as well. By summer, there are many flowers that attract our pollinators. And I'll start over here on this upper left again. This is hairy honeysuckle. It's named for its fuzzy leaves. Drop down to taper tip onion. Middle is coral bells, and then fireweed, and they all offer nectar. If cats visit the garden, avoid low-growing flowers like the wild onion or the coral bells that can put a hummingbird within a cat's reach. It is fascinating to observe that as one native plant stops flowering, another begins. And our native honeysuckles give an example of that floral succession. More flowers for hummingbirds include Western columbine, native penstemons, Western azalea, tiger lilies, and plants in the mint family, and some are native and some are not, but look for the genus Stachys, Nepeta, Salvia, and Monarda, and they all attract hummingbirds. By November, the hardy fuchsia has some of the last flowers that continue to bloom up until frost. And the Anna's hummingbird has extended its range north from California along the West Coast, in part due to our garden plantings of fuchsias and the use of year-round hummingbird feeders. And here you can see the gorget on the male rufous is magenta, and curiously it matches the fuchsia colored flowers, which is interesting. And our rufous hummingbird shown earlier loves the orange trumpet honeysuckle, and I hadn't really noticed that before. It seems coincidental, but kind of interesting also. So Fuchsia magellanica is native to South America, and it is the parent of many of the hybrid fuchsias. For those that choose to put out a hummingbird feeder, be careful about the design. One winter, a local biologist found an Anna's hummingbird with 1 foot frozen to a metal perch. So be sure the feeder is plastic. Even in winter, they still need to be cleaned and the sugar water refreshed. And this particular design comes from the Seattle Audubon store. Very practical design, easy to clean, and it has this continuous plastic perch that runs around it. And here, the squirrel baffle is keeping snow off of a hummingbird feeder nicely, and also keeps the rain off too. So in springtime, hummingbirds are looking for nest sites and branches with lichen, I think for camouflage. And this little Anna's chose kind of a funky little place here in a English holly, unfortunately, in a school greenbelt behind my house. So I'd go there after work and it would be kind of dark. So it wasn't the best for photos in the rain. But here were her two young hummingbirds. And the nests are made from spider webs, moss, lichen, thistledown, and other downy parts of plants. Lichens are an indicator of good air quality. They don't harm the plants they grow on, to my knowledge. And here's another nest. See if you can find the hummingbird. Different location, but also very well camouflaged. This one's better camouflage. She's out in the sun, so she needs to be surrounded by these plants. There she is. Okay, well, let's take a little break there if you need a bathroom break or if you have questions before we go on to food plants for songbirds.
Okay, I do have a question about the National Wildlife Federation. You talked to, I didn't catch the address. I was wondering if you would give it to me and I'll put it in the chat because that sounds really interesting.
I was wondering, I don't have a chat access here on the screen, but sure, it is just www.nwf.org.
Okay.
And then the / for certify shows the list of landscape, wildlife friendly landscape practices. And I think that might be what you want to look at because it can give you ideas. Oh, that's what I need to do, or that's what I could do, or that's what I already have.
And what does it mean to become certified as a wildlife habitat?
It means you've filled out this checklist. So you're thinking about what birds and wildlife need in their garden. And a lot of it is actually native plants. If you have native plants, it will check a lot of the boxes on that checklist. And you send in, I think, $20 one time, and then you are recognized as a backyard wildlife habitat. And National Wildlife Federation can use those certifications to help get grants. They can say we have this many people in this region, and it can help attain grants that further protecting habitat for birds and wildlife. So it connects you to a larger organization and just helps support their educational activities.
Okay, that sounds great. I'll put that in the chat. There is a question about milkweeds. Do you have any thoughts about milkweed in Puget Sound? Are there any natives?
We don't truly have native milkweed here, although I've heard that the milkweed that's native further south in the Willamette Valley and in eastern Washington has been found a little bit randomly near some railroad tracks. So I don't think it really has established here. It's more that it might have come in somehow. And you can try to grow, so that's speciosa. That's Asclepias speciosa is native to eastern Washington. And I am growing a tiny, not super happy plant because my garden grows ferns. It's just too damp. But somebody with a sunny site with well-drained soil might do better with it. Think eastern Washington, sandy soils, lots of sun. And the other one is Asclepias fascicularis, is native to eastern Washington. And I think it grows in slightly damper locations, so it might tolerate our moisture better. I'm experimenting with that now. And the other kinds of milkweed are native to other parts of North America.
Okay, Regina Johnson says that there are no native milkweed in Western Washington, that the one near the railroad tracks was one that was never found again.
Ah,
So it hadn't been established.
right, right. That sounds right. Thanks, Regina. Yeah.
Barbara asks, would the first 4 books that you mentioned be useful for folks in Spokane? Or are those just for Western Washington?
So landscaping for wildlife in the Pacific Northwest, it's statewide. So I would definitely give that one a try. It's just so helpful. And then the National Wildlife book is not as specific with plants because it's more about what what kind of brush piles and what are the things you need to snags and logs and how do those things help birds and wildlife and still have a beautiful garden, because that's meant for all of North America. So it's just a little less specific. And the Talamy books, Doug Talamy books, well, they're really concept books because he lives on the East Coast, but he still manages to convey the importance of growing native plants, regardless where you live, and the benefits that doing so has for birds. So I would definitely look at Talamy's books as well.
Okay. Brian Zinke posted a link from Audubon that has a native plants database. So that, I'm sure you're familiar with that, but he posted that in the chat. So that may be helpful for people.
It's excellent. Thank you, Brian. Yes, that's a very good database for native plants.
Okay, well, why don't we press on, and there'll probably be more questions as we go.
Okay, so natural food for birds includes fruits such as berries, seeds, and insects. This section features native shrubs and trees that grow well in gardens, and we'll start with shrubs that flower in spring. So osoberry grows in the forest understory. There is a special loveliness to this shrub when it flowers and signals the end of winter, usually mid-March, but it's flowering at my place right now. So I guess we're a little early this year. There are separate male and female plants, and both flower beautifully, but only the female will have fruits. The upright form of Western serviceberry makes it a good choice for gardens. It grows about 15 to 20 feet tall, and it is a magnet for cedar waxwings when the berries ripen in early summer. These edible berries were dried and eaten by Native Americans, and today they're still used for jam. They really are fairly tasty. They can be a little dry if the plant itself hasn't had a lot of water, but often they have good flavor, so that's not surprising. If you accidentally buy serviceberry from Eastern North America, you may end up with a tree that's 35 feet tall. So be careful about the species name, and to find Western serviceberry, choose alnifolia. Now, twinberry on the left is a shrub honeysuckle, and it grows to about 8 or 10 feet tall with just kind of sprawling branches. Its flowers attract hummingbirds from April right into July, and then the berries ripen and it attracts songbirds. Red elderberry is favored by our coastal band-tailed pigeons. This is a native bird, and they also eat the berries of Pacific madrone and our Cornus natalii, our native Western dogwood, Pacific dogwood. And red elderberry is a large shrub, about 15 feet tall and wide at the most, maybe only 10 or 12, but it's kind of sprawling. And both twinberry and red elderberry are not super attractive by themselves. So add them to a shrub border where they'll have the support and interest of other flowering shrubs. Now, spotted towhees nest and forage in low shrubs and on the ground, and one of their favorite summer foods is this red huckleberry. And towhees will hop up from the ground and pluck a berry, sometimes the whole shrub just shakes with their activity in there. And this is red huckleberry was also one of our shrubs on the host plant list for moths. So 24 species, I believe. So that's another reason to plant it. It only grows slowly to about 6 feet tall. It's fairly narrow usually, and it's attractive. It's got green branches all winter long, and um, it does best in gardens with bright shade and good drainage. It's really a forest shrub. So if you are working with a shade garden, you could try this. If you only have a patio and it's shady, you could also try red huckleberry in a planter because it's one of our smaller native shrubs. Evergreen huckleberry also grows slowly to 6 or 7 feet, and it is a preferred food for hermit thrush. And each autumn, these birds return and glean berries in the hedgerow. Evergreen huckleberry is probably one of the more attractive native shrubs all year round. Again, you could try this in a small landscape or in a planter. You might have to prune it if it gets too big, but it's not huge and it's lovely. So that's one I would recommend. If you have evergreen huckleberry, be on the watch for this rust fungus problem you see here in the corner. This is a systemic problem. If your plant gets it, the whole plant will eventually die. And I have tried just removing one long stem well below the rust fungus area, and the plant recovered for about 1 year. And the following year, the rust fungus returned. So then I believed the advice and I dug it out, and it went in the trash, which is a hard thing to have to do, but I think we should be watchful that we don't let a problem like that spread. Now, ground nesting birds like the dark-eyed junco may use salal as a nest site. Salal has an abundance of berries, and its broad leaves offer shelter and protection and make it popular with ground nesting birds. You may start to notice that native shrubs often provide nest sites as well as a source of food, so they offer more than one aspect of habitat. Cascara is a mid-sized tree, maybe to 30 feet, but it's fairly round, so it's also a good shade tree along with red alder. And its flowers attract hummingbirds. In June, yellow warblers may be found in the branches foraging for insects. Later in summer, there are berries for songbirds. And Russell Link lists cascara as used by 12 species of birds. Now, some of you may know the book, Real Gardens Grow Natives, and the author is Eileen Stark. And if you don't have that book, it's wonderful. And this is her photo she kindly shared. So I like to mention that book as well. Real Gardens Grow Natives. It's also a website, and so you can learn a lot. There's a very interesting blog there. So that might be something you would like to look at. Now, black hawthorn is native, and it's a beautiful 25-foot or so tree with rich autumn colors and berries that are relished by birds. It's not to be confused with the weedy European species that has naturalized in some areas. Avoid planting trees with berries near sidewalks, driveways, or decks so you don't have berries on those surfaces. And Douglas hawthorn, or black hawthorn, was also on the list of host plants for Lepidoptera. Now, Steller's jay is often found in trees with seeds. They prefer hazelnuts and pines. And shore pine is a mid-sized tree for very sunny and well-drained sites. And it has a, I think, lovely pine needle mulch will build up under it. And so here again, avoid planting it near sidewalks or driveways or decks where that might be a problem. Instead, choose a place where the pine needles can remain on the ground and form a natural mulch. And red-breasted sapsuckers make sap wells for their food supply. Look for them on mature trees where they make rows of small holes. Here one has chosen a 30-year-old lilac branch. Hummingbirds may also visit the sap wells, and birds find occasionally extra protein in insects that have been trapped there. These are the seeds of western red cedar. And in the upper left, we have a pine siskin. And one stormy winter day, a flock of 50 or more pine siskins took shelter in these branches all at once. Western screech owls may camouflage themselves close to the trunk. Chestnut-backed chickadees are almost always present, and the cedar hairstreak relies on western red cedar as a larval host plant. Douglas fir offers nest sites and supports hawks, owls, and eagles. And at the same time, it attracts the smallest songbird, the golden crowned kinglet. These tiny birds forage high in the trees, and they may not come down to gardens for feeders, although sometimes they do for water. And golden crowned kinglets are found in coniferous forests and neighborhoods with these trees. Now, it is possible to have a western screech owl use a nest box, but it is more likely that you'll have squirrels move in. The last time screech owls tried to nest here, a Steller's jay took up an issue with it and would perch in the opening and squawk into the box for over a week until the owls finally deserted and gave up. Before that, we had western screech owls in the neighborhood throughout the year. And it had been a long time since I'd heard one. And then one day I was walking the dog before work, 6:30 a.m. in February, and one called from close by. The setting was unlikely. It was a suburban subdivision with streetlights, sidewalks, houses, very little habitat. So I paused to look around. In front of me was a typical house with small trees, a driveway, and there by the garage was one of those portable basketball hoops. And on each side of the rim sat a western screech owl. As good as it was to see them, they looked like poster children for habitat loss. If you have the opportunity to preserve a snag, it will be well used by birds and wildlife. This pileated woodpecker is working on a 30-foot snag that was intentionally left for birds. It took 4 or 5 years before it was used for nest sites. And in the meantime, the birds use the trunk to find insects. The red-breasted nuthatch relies on the furrowed bark of large trees as it moves headfirst down the tree trunk. It prefers to nest in a snag. It's unlikely to use a nest box. And the same is true of the brown creeper. Brown creepers nest in a gap between the outer bark and the trunk of a tree. They spiral upwards as they forage on mature forest trees. Many birds will make use of a brush pile. Logs and branches can be placed where they're visible or hidden out of the way if you don't like how they look. A Bewick's wren is likely to appear within a few hours and may nest there. Song sparrows, spotted towhees, and other birds of the lower habitat layers will also investigate. Nesting takes place from February into June. Sometimes there's more than one nest. And it's important not to compress the pile or block openings during these months. If you build a brush pile one week and you leave it for a while, try not to add any more new brush. Place new brush nearby on the ground and wait for late summer to combine the piles. Find a place to leave logs and stumps in the landscape. Salamanders spend much of their lives under fallen logs. Tree frogs will find shelter there as they move across land. And garter snakes eat slug eggs if they have natural places where they can hide. And birds will find grubs and invertebrates in logs as they decay. Logs and rocks add interest to a naturalistic setting while they improve habitat. This native plant garden is at Seward Park in South Seattle. Another form of shelter is found in dense plantings of evergreen shrubs. These plants mature at 20 feet or less, allowing sunlight to continue to reach the garden. And they follow the fence line as seen from the neighbor's side. A green wire fence keeps our dog in and the neighborhood cats out. From inside the garden, the hedgerow has more dimension. And this was the location for that western fence line. You can't even see it anymore. And it's remarkable how many birds use it as a corridor, considering there had been nothing here but grass. Pacific wax myrtle in particular attracts yellow rump warblers, northern flickers, ruby crowned kinglets, and bush tits. Avoid shearing. The plant's natural forms are interesting, and they have horizontal layers that birds prefer. Pacific wax myrtle in particular is doing a good job of hiding this snag. And next we'll zoom into that snag so we can see fledgling bush tits as they soak up the sun. Their nest is made from an unusual woven sac that's found in small trees and shrubs with fine twiggy branches. Bush tits live in neighborhoods with well-developed shrub layers. And so next we'll look at sustainable practices. And I think it's well known that English ivy has spread out of control on the left. It weakens trees and it overwhelms lower shrub layers and ground layers. Yellow archangel has also escaped into natural areas where it quickly takes over. Invasive plants reduce habitat because they outcompete the native plants that birds and wildlife rely on. In comparison, salal on the right offers berries, nectar, shelter, and nest sites, while it crowds out weeds and it doesn't harm trees. And encourage neighbors, family, and friends to reduce or eliminate their use of herbicides and pesticides with these garden friends in mind. Most insects are beneficial. A large percentage of them are helpful in our gardens, and we need them to restore balance and give birds their natural food. Learn to recognize at the top the larvae of the lacewing and the ladybug larvae at the bottom. They both, adults and larvae, feed on aphids and other garden pests. And keep cats indoors. This works best if they're kept inside from the time they're young. The number of birds killed by cats is staggering, and combined with the number of birds that hit windows, it seems we could do more to protect birds, and we can. Go to abcbirds.org, American Bird Conservancy, and birdsavers.com for solutions. An alternative to allowing cats outside is to build a cat run. And this owner-built run at the top protects a cat from a busy road. Catio Spaces is a Seattle company, and they have do-it-yourself kits as well as custom designs for outdoor cat enclosures. In the garden, wire fencing has been added to the top of gates to discourage neighborhood cats. Most of the time it works, but in case a cat gets in, I do have a very determined neighbor cat. I've added this folding wire fence near bird baths. It slows the cat down and it makes it difficult for cats to crouch and pounce. It just gives birds a little more time to get away. So mulching with leaves is probably my favorite sustainable practice because it can help reduce lawn and it's so easy. Winter birds that are likely to forage on the ground in leaf mulch include the golden crowned sparrow, prairie thrush, and fox sparrow. Throughout the year, robins, towhees, song sparrows, flickers, and other birds forage on the ground. To get started mulching with leaves, designate an area of lawn that you don't really need anymore, and you can pile the leaves up like you see in this picture. Or leaves can be just simply raked under trees and shrubs. Leave them throughout the year because they are enriching the soil and encouraging earthworms and invertebrates that the birds will feed on. If you rake them all away, then that activity stops. When we create and preserve places for nature by adding a log or brush pile and mulching with leaves, small creatures can overwinter and continue their life cycle. Queen bumblebees, the morning cloak butterfly, and a salamander all overwinter in these places. And the last landscape feature, water, can attract birds that don't otherwise come to gardens. These warblers, the flycatcher and vireo, all visit this small man-made stream during migration. They find their way here by following corridors of vegetation. Most gardens will start small with a bird bath and a few shrubs. And if there are enough like-minded neighbors, gardens can connect and become flight corridors. Hummingbirds are attracted to moving water, and this rufous hummingbird is catching spray that's bouncing off one of the rocks. The vertical sides of these rocks prevent smaller birds from reaching the water. Instead, provide water that's shallow that allows birds to stand as they bathe and drink. A shallow puddle with a rough surface works well. Bird baths need to be brushed out frequently and refilled, as much as every day in summer. If it's been raining a lot, you might get by every few days, but they do require maintenance. Stay on top of it so the water stays clean and doesn't spread disease. Now, if cats are a concern, I was going to suggest a bird bath on a pedestal, but I don't have one. So I went online to look for examples, and here's what came up. It's fun when we're in person because there's usually a room full of people laughing right about now, and I have to wait for the laughter to die down. Okay, so, the message is clear. If cats visit the garden, it's best not to put out bird bath or bird feeders. You can still continue to plant trees and shrubs because they don't concentrate the birds the same way, and they give them hiding places. Returning to the garden, the native plants blend into the green belt and display their beauty. They have horizontal as well as vertical layers that are bird friendly. In review, avoid garden chemicals, reduce lawn, mulch with leaves, create shelter, create a thicket or a hedgerow, use native shrubs, trees, and berries, provide water year-round, and keep cats indoors. These backyard photos show some of the wild visitors that now come to the garden. So on the left, we have a barred owl. Do you see him? The barred owls, this is in the western red cedar, and they've displaced the western screech owls, and that reflects a regional trend. And then we have rufous hummingbirds still return in spring and summer. And butterflies, not as many as there used to be, but if we're lucky, we still get some butterflies. And even the rare western bumblebee was found here. But that's another story. And they're all here because it is possible to put habitat back in place. So thank you for your interest in planting native plants and learning how to create habitat for wildlife. And it's, yes, the birds and wildlife will come, so will the moths and butterflies, but it's rewarding the whole way to watch all of that happen and see all the beauty that is brought to your yard. So thank you very much. That's the end of the program, and we have time for questions.
Thank you very much, Julie. That was really terrific. There are a lot of really fabulous comments in the chat function, but I do want to go to a few of the questions that are posted here before we open things up for general discussion. One question is about plants that may be toxic to dogs or other animals. Regina mentioned that none of the berries you mentioned are poisonous, but I wondered if you might be able to add to that.
I don't know about to dogs. I had dogs, I don't anymore. And we have blueberries, so they just like to eat the blueberries. And my neighbor's dog likes to eat the apples. So maybe it's good to have, a food plant that is safe if you've got pets, and then they'll go to those. The only one I know that might be toxic is the twinberry. And it's kind of vague. The information on that is vague, but I don't trust it, just from what I've read. And then snowberries are also, I think they taste terrible, so I don't know if anything would eat them anyway, but white berries are considered not a good idea, not really as edible as others. And Oregon grape, if they ate them, they're not toxic, they're just bitter.
Okay, you addressed this just a moment ago about the barred owls, and generally speaking, they tend to drive away the smaller owls. Is that correct?
Oh, it's even worse. What happens is the western screech owls, fledglings, are on the ground, kind of helpless and squawking for food. And we used to actually have them doing that in our backyard on a summer night. They'd keep us awake if the windows were open. That was before the barred owls came in. And barred owls are also trying to feed their nest of young. So the western screech owl fledglings become prey. They become food for the barred owls.
Oh my. Okay. Is fringe cup a plant of value to wildlife?
Well, pollinators use it. It's not as attractive as some other things. I mean, if I look, it's a lovely plant. So you just grow it because it's a lovely plant. But I'm not aware of, maybe hummingbirds might use that some. I'm a bit of a fan of planting our native shrubs because you get this huge bouquet of food for hummingbirds or butterflies or pollinators when you plant a shrub. And snowberry is even an example of that. Bumblebees and hummingbirds both use snowberry. And as you saw, there were 21 Lepidoptera larval species using it too. So it's a good all-around plant, but it does spread to form a thicket. It spreads kind of slowly. It flowers more and has more berries in full sun.
Okay, that's the end of the questions that are in chat. As I say, there are a lot of great comments. And so what I'd like to do now is open it up for general discussion. There's just so much interesting stuff. I don't want to repeat it all, but please unmute and feel free to share your observations.
There, okay, stop share. Gary's here in the background.
May I bounce right in?
Oh, hi,
Yes.
Bob.
Hi, Julie. Good to see you, old friend. That was beautiful, beautiful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great to see you all. Also, everybody remembered the Xerces Society books on these subjects, Attracting Native Pollinators to Your Garden, a very good one.
Yes.
All the books Judy mentioned.
That's a great point, and that Bob gave that address in the chat function if you're interested.
Yeah.
I do need to comment on that, Bob.
Yes.
I'm glad you did that. And the only reason they're not in this program is they are up front and center in my other two programs.
All right. Okay.
And I thought, I'll make this program a little different.
Sure. Now, my main thing, Stuart and Regina know what I'm going to say. And I'm going to sound like a devil's advocate and kind of throwing cold water on the parade in a way, but I'm not really. It's just a voice of realism and being specific and being very honest and being discriminating. I have great admiration for Doug Tallamy. I think he overstates his case sometimes, and sometimes in too concrete of a way, too absolute of a way, I mean to say. And I've had some discussions with my friends at Xerces on this too, and some of the issues of wings that have featured Doug. Great honor to all that he's done and his great books. But he makes statements such as butterflies prefer native plants, and it ain't necessarily so. To start with, I'm a life member of the Washington Native Plant Society, as was Tia. And in all cases, if a native plant to my district will serve the purpose and can be cultivated, that's to be preferred. If I could push the button tomorrow to restore the native flora, I would do it in a moment without a thought, even though there would be much loss incurred in doing that, much to gain too. I mean, just Lamium galobdulon, how do you like that for a name? The yellow archangel. I mean, I will not demonize any organism. We tend to demonize these things to fight them. I won't do that. They're just doing what they're evolved to do. It's not a bad plant. But it's a horrible plant in many ways. I mean, it's the worst of all the invasives. And I've spent hundreds and hundreds of dollars hiring local people to help me fight the yellow archangel, because it spreads not only by seed, but by runners. Then it will take over entire habitats of many different kinds. It's a great danger to our habitats. And I've also spent a great deal of effort removing English ivy. And I've spent a great deal of my own backbone and sweat removing Scots broom and so on. So I am very aware of non-native plant issues and have worked on them ever since I was the Northwest Land Steward for the Nature Conservancy 40 years ago, when I did it for a living on all the TNC preserves in the Northwest. But having said that, many of our native invertebrates and vertebrates have adapted to the presence of European and Asian plants in our midst. And in some cases, have done so to the great benefit of the species, particularly in the absence of the native plants with which they co-evolved. Because in lots of cases, their native co-evolved plants are not there anymore. But in many of those cases, something that has come in has furnished for them a base to live by. And we can come up with all kinds of examples. The big joke example, of course, is monarchs in California. The West Coast monarchs wouldn't even be there without eucalyptus, right? And so there's many such examples, but just one here in Washington. Yes, Julie, we agree that the native cherries are so very important to those insects that use them, including the two-tailed tiger swallowtail, our largest butterfly. But two-tailed tiger swallowtail is one of the most dominant urban butterflies and countryside butterflies everywhere from Calgary to Mexico City, because of their adaptation to green ash, Fraxinus viridis, which has been planted as a shade tree in arid western towns all over North America in the West. It's become a vastly more abundant butterfly because of that, particularly in areas where the native cherries have been removed. And I could go on with example after example. Plus, people use the word native in such a sloppy way. All of us do, I do too. But we talk about a plant being native if it occurs in Idaho, and we'll plant it in the Sea and say we're planting a native plant. And that's not necessarily the case. We plant lots of plants native to Washington, in Western Washington, and they're no more evolutionarily acquainted with the habitat in which we as individuals live than something that came from Germany. It's just that they're native 300 miles from here. That doesn't make them native here. So we use that name in a very, very Catholic way. Now, here's my point, and I'll stop with this. I absolutely support removing unhelpful, non-indigenous plants for the betterment of plants that are and the animals that use their services. However, before you do so, it's very, very important to survey and watch, sit and look what's using the plants that are already there. And if you have a stand, no, pick a plant, some non-native plant. Well, okay, here's an example. I've talked about this with Regina and Paulette, that if you have a stand of the pink popsicle pea plant, you know, the wild so-called sweet pea that doesn't even smell like sweet peas. I don't like the word invasive because of its obviously very now contemporaneously very, very current use, but it puts human cultural baggage on a plant to call it invasive. But a plant that's adventitious and comes in a big way and crowds out native things you'd rather have, like the pink popsicle pea. Okay, get rid of it by all means, but be aware that in many areas, 4 of our largest skippers are using it for a nectar plant, 2 of them for a caterpillar host plant. Now, if you get rid of that and you've got Thorbes pilates, the western cloudy wing, using it in your canyon, and you get rid of it and you don't have the native Lathyrus that it would use otherwise, then you're extirpating that butterfly. So I'm saying, keep an eye out, see what is using the plants that are there before you re-engineer an area and plant a bunch of native plants, because you might be extirpating a lot of native animals in the process, and then they're not going to be there to recolonize your natives once they get established. So by all means, fight the non-natives, plant the natives, but do so in a knowledgeable way and be aware that a lot of animals do adapt to non-indigenous plants out of absolute need. And if they've done so, you still might want to change the plants, and that's fine. But just know what you're doing before you get rid of them. That's all. That's my point.
That's great, Bob, and thank you so much for chiming in with all of that. I think it's a question of focus, and Julie's an educator, and we are so grateful for all the work that she does. Do you want to?
No kidding, Julie's the best. Julie, I've been your admirer and your biggest fan for the longest time, and none of that, by the way, was said to countermand anything you said in your talk. It was a beautifully balanced talk in all that respect.
Well, thanks, Bob. And I want to give an example that speaks to what you just said, and that is our Himalayan blackberry, because I was involved with a group that was removing a large stand of it. And it was winter, it was probably February, and we had to stop and do it in stages because of the birds that were nesting in there.
Yeah, no kidding. The biologist of I live in between 2 national wildlife refuges, and one of them to the east of me, the biologist told me one time, he said, now don't tell anybody, but the single most valuable cover plant on our refuge for diversity of birds and mammals is Himalayan blackberry. They're still replacing them with natives, but they're doing so very selectively to make sure they don't get rid of a big habitat for golden ground sparrows in the wintertime with something naked. And even Japanese knotweed has cover value for certain plants. Even that, before you devastate it over an area, you want to have some pretty good idea of what to replace it with.
So Regina has her hand raised. I wouldn't be surprised if she has something to contribute. Regina, can you unmute?
Yes, I certainly have plenty to contribute, but I'm going to limit it. I'm still waiting, Bob, for you to send me the list of insects that are using that pea vine, because I am controlling it. I'm sorry. So
it needs to be controlled.
You can send me, please do so, because I want to know what I'm doing.
I'll do that.
The other comment was that Doug Tallamy gets the credit for work that other people did. And I had the privilege of attending a webinar by one of the women whose work he bases his books on. And one of the comments she made that was very interesting is that, I forget the exact percentages, but something like 10% of the native plants in any given flora are doing all the work of supporting insects and wildlife. And most native plants, if you're just planting native plants that you picked at random, they're not necessarily supporting anything any better than any non-native plant would be. So, I mean, Julie's list is really what you want to look at.
Yes.
Definitely, because those are the ones that are known to support stuff. And the other plants, if you're just picking plants at random because they're pretty, you may not be doing any good. You might as well be planting a non-native rhododendron. Which, I mean, they make good nesting habitat too. Carl had a comment about insects using non-native knapweeds as a nectar source. And we struggle with that a lot in all the restoration work I do, because most of the late season nectar sources have been extirpated, the native thistles and stuff. So insects have shifted to using tansy ragwort, Canada thistle, spotted knapweed, because that's what's available. And frankly, nectar is nectar, doesn't matter what plant it's coming from. But yeah, I mean, if people could plant native thistles, I know Julia's tried and it's not, you haven't had much success, right?
No, actually, Stuart had seed for Cirsium brevistylum, and that's done really well. So,
good. Okay.
Yeah.
We have
Good.
planted some in some of our restorations, and some years absolutely nothing takes. And sometimes some of them take. And
Okay,
sometimes.
so we have another hand raised. Jan, can you unmute and ask your question? And this is free discussion. There are a couple questions I do want to get to though before we close. So go ahead, Jan.
I have two questions. I live just past the Hood Canal floating bridge on the Olympic Peninsula on Hood Canal. And we have 5 acres, but we just bought the acre next door to us, mostly so it wouldn't go away from being habitat and become a big giant house. But it has a lot of blackberries on it, and I know the quail are nesting in there. And so we're trying to figure out, you know, to get, like, not have the blackberries take over everything, but try to maintain enough of it to have nesting, and then try to figure out what can we do to encourage the nesting and maybe have fewer blackberries, if anybody has an idea on that. And then the other one.
Yes, I'll answer that one when you're ready.
Oregon grape. And we have this gigantic thing that was planted that I'm sure probably isn't natural at all. That's like a giant Oregon grape with giant thistles. And in about December, it blooms and has all these like spiked out yellow blooms that the hummingbirds just love, and there's hardly anything else. And I'm just wondering if any of the native Oregon grape work in the same way or not. This giant thistly thing, they love it, but boy, you don't want to get near the thing unless you have like your armor on and your big clippers.
I know what you're talking about. That is an Asian cross or some kind of a hybrid, and there are several of them. They're named. You get them at plant nurseries, and I don't know of any natives that bloom in winter like those do. But people
Really?
love them because of the hummingbirds in winter.
Huh.
Yeah, but the native ones will be blooming soon.
In April.
Not soon. We're in March.
She's talking about December, November, December,
Yeah.
January.
December, January, which is a really good time to bloom for the hummingbirds.
Well, another one that's really good for the Anna's hummingbirds in the winter in the city, in both Portland and Seattle, is Prunus autumnalis. You know, the non-native cherry that blooms in the wintertime in the cities, and the hummingbirds use it a lot. And there's no sin, there's no crime. You know, Julie, it's like your fuchsias. I got the winter fuchsias. They just dropped their last flowers a few weeks ago. And there's no crime to use these plants. You mustn't feel as if you're a villain because you choose to use a plant from a different habitat in your garden.
Well, I hope
So
I didn't
about
make
the
anyone
quail.
feel that way because I grow things
Right.
everywhere. But Bob,
Right.
the reason I focus on native plants is that's where the questions are. People have been requesting and requesting. And so,
No, you're exactly right. You got the focus just right. That's what you do and that's what you should do. And then, but you also show in your pictures that you make the sensible choice occasionally of a plant that works for the purpose.
So
Yeah,
about the quail
that's right.
now, I
oh
have
yeah, the quail and blackberries. Okay.
I have quail and I have blackberries. I live in Tumwater. And we actually have two different coveys of California quail in my neighborhood. They would not be here without the Himalayan blackberry. That is their protection from the cats and all the other predators. They're both not native. The quail are not native. They were introduced as a game species, and the blackberry is not native. So this is an anthropogenic landscape. I'm fine with it because I like quail.
Yeah.
And I cannot get rid of the blackberry no matter how hard I try because it's not all on my property. So, you know, the blackberry is there no matter what, and the quail like it.
There's a question here that I would like to address. It's come up a couple times for what to plant instead of a lawn in an area that needs a ground cover. Is there better choices than others?
Can we do that after I still want to talk with Jan about the blackberries, but it's
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
just wanted to make
Just
sure that
we're there.
question gets
Okay.
answered because he's been
so
working
yeah,
on
and
that.
I heard what you're saying, Jan, and I think you're right on. You can just restrict. You can you can put some posts, some stakes, and say, I'm not going to let it go past the blackberry past here. And then it is a lot of work, though. I've had to remove blackberry in my back corner, and I'd be out there several times a summer pruning the branches and digging out any that managed to root that were going past my, like, you've got to stay back. So you can work with it that way. It's work. I heard goats though might eat blackberry. So you could look into that, renting some goats. That might be fun.
Well, we have bears too. They might like the goats.
Uh-oh.
Do you have any other ideas of what I could put over there in place of the blackberries for the quail nesting?
The first thing, am I being heard?
Yes, Stuart. Go
The
ahead.
first thing that comes to mind is ocean spray. It is a dense shrub, native, and I expect a patch of ocean spray would support a lot of the same wildlife that a patch of Himalayan blackberries would.
Okay.
It's also such a good butterfly plant. I'm so glad you talked about it, Julie, because it's one of the very best host plants for echo azures, and it's one of the very best host plants for Lorquins admirals, and it's one of the very best host plants for pale tiger swallowtails. It's a crappy nectar plant, but as a caterpillar host plant, it's superb.
Can it
the ocean spray fairy moths.
What's
can
that?
it handle salt, a little bit of salt spray or not?
Can
Since I'm right on Hood Canal, we get a little.
Oh, yes, it definitely can. It's very, very big on San Juan Island. In fact, it's the only host plant really for spring azures, echo azures on San Juan, because everything else dries out too soon.
Okay, thank you.
And Jan, here's a thought. You might try the native roses, but boy, they're nasty in their own right. Oh my goodness, Nootka rose. And it spreads and it's thorny and prickly, but it has rose hips and it would be great cover.
I do have a lot of that
You
actually.
have that already. Okay.
Yeah.
And then I wonder how well snowberry would do at protecting the quail.
Right.
I
was
have
wondering that too.
that too, but it's in the shade more. This is more open.
Yeah, no, snowberry wants sun. It likes sun.
Oh, okay.
So you're good.
Okay.
If you're planting roses, some nurseries consider the rugosa rose to be a native plant, and it is not.
No.
And I am working really hard to eradicate rugosa rose in the Hood Canal area and on our nature preserves. It's a nasty one.
Interesting, because that's probably what I've got. I don't know. I think
Well, there's tons and tons of Nootka rose, and the rugosa rose is just starting to pop up. It's like the seeds are floating up from quilcene or something. I don't know.
Well, the use is highway medians in Oregon a great deal. A lot of it travels.
Well, in Olympia too. It's spreading out of the medians in Olympia. We call it the freeway rose here because that's where it's planted. But
How
no,
do I-
Mecca rose is really abundant on the beaches, and it's native, and it would probably be great cover.
I wonder which one I have.
How big are the hips?
I don't know, they're not all that big.
Okay,
How
then
big
you
are
probably have Nootka, because
big.
the rugosa hips are as big as a cherry tomato.
Rosa rugosa is covered with nasty thorns.
That's the
Um,
one I got, I think.
Okay, it also has
No.
deep grooves in as veins. The veins are all deeply grooved in the leaflets.
And
Okay.
the hips are as big as a cherry tomato, literally.
So Jan, next summer, maybe you could send some photos. You could send them to like the Washington Native Plant Society Facebook page. People will help you ID. Some of us might even see it there. And close up of the thorns or the prickles actually, and the leaves and the rose hips and the flowers too.
Yeah, these may have been planted, but they love it here. They're taking over whatever they are. And the quail do use them.
Okay, can we move to the question
Yeah.
about ground cover?
Yes, thank you. Yes. Right, that is, I personally haven't done much with that other than just allowing clover to grow in my lawn. And I have a friend who's trying to establish, and I'm also trying to establish, but not in the lawn so much, some of our native annual seeds. And my problem with our native seeds is that the birds tend to eat the seeds, and if they do manage to sprout, then the rabbits eat the sprouts. So if someone's having greater success with this, please jump in.
I would like to say a
All the
word
same
about,
problems.
I'd like to say a word about lawns. Again, this is sacrilege, this is heresy. But I've always loved lawns all my life. 'Cause I grew up mostly with the lawn as a kid, as where I could go, as a little, and we didn't spray the lawns. And the lawn had a lot of diversity because it had clover, and the clover had eastern-tailed blues on it. And the grass, the bluegrass, had tawny-edged skippers on it. And actually, lawns can be wonderful habitats. They're just grasslands. And if they're not sprayed, and if they're diverse, you can have a lawn, you can get some veronica in there. You can get, what they do in Logan, Utah, when I taught there, the Scott's lawn care people go around to your house and put a little list on your porch of all the plants that you should feel bad of having in your lawn that you need to get rid of, why you need to sign up with them to spray them. And one of their most common plants that they would play on people's guilt about were violets, viola. I don't know what species, probably some version of viola odorata, I imagine. But they grow as lawn weeds, and they're so beautiful, and they're so fragrant, and they're such a good nectar plant for all the lawn skippers. So if you just have a lawn that's not cut too short and has veronica and clover and viola and a little bit of whatever species of dandelion you can deal with, you can still have a pleasant lawn to play in with kids, and you're not going to poison them. But you also can have quite a bit of butterfly and moth use and other pollinators. So here's the great glory. I have some kind of viola adunca from the garden that Tia had planted, spreading all through my so-called lawn that I don't mow very much. And now I've got Western meadow fritillaries breeding in my lawn. Now, how's that?
That's
Well,
great.
Oh,
Western meadow fritillaries is a lawn butterfly, and I've got Clodius parnassians just beyond that in the bleeding hearts, in a stand of totally native plants that I maintain that way. Any non-native gets anywhere near there, it's dead, But in the lawn, bring on all kinds of diversity, and we got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of woodland skippers, quite a few large wood nymphs, and now Western meadow fritillaries in the lawn. That's cool. So lawns are not necessarily bad. There's lawns and there's lawns.
So Christy just contributed that native yarrow spreads into her lawn, and they just mow it down along with the grass. And Carolyn says that she has viola adunca, and that spreads like a weed, but it's nice too. There is another question, and I just want to get to the questions that people have taken the trouble to get in the chat, and then, I'm fine with people just kind of piling in, but I do want to get to a couple of these questions. One is about massing plants. Let me see. I always read that you should plant perennials in drifts of 5 or 7 for the pollinators. Is that still accurate, or should you mix in other species?
Oh, planting drifts, they're going to find the pollinators aren't that fussy really, but I think butterflies especially are more likely to find clusters of flowers that are big enough. I've just noticed when I've planted a few plants just getting started, they don't receive as much visitation as when the plants are bigger and there's more of it. So I think the larger patch just seems to attract more. But those rules are partly design wise too. So, usually odd numbers, 3 or 5 or 7 are considered a little more aesthetic, a little more natural looking. But more is generally better for flowers.
Okay, Kathy says, don't forget the moss and the clover. Clover, violets, and moss are growing in with the cress that she has. So cress is a good idea.
Yeah, and that reminds me, just even letting some of the things, vegetable garden plants go to seed and come up on their own. And you can end up with the brassicas especially, they're going to be a host plant, and things will come in nectar on the flowers. And yeah, you can definitely relax is better for birds and wildlife. I like to say less disturbance seems better in general, just less disturbance, not keeping every square inch perfect, and letting things go and see what they'll do, letting the plants do their thing, go to seed or spread.
So Dan, you have another question. Do you want to unmute and go ahead and ask yourself?
It's creating a backyard habitat.
Oh, so the question from
Here we
Dan,
go.
are
Okay.
you there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
So we have we're on Mercer Island. In our backyard, we've left as a natural area, slight slope, seasonal drainage, and a little creek-like thing, roaring in the last week. And there's a 90-year-old big leaf maple, beautiful tree. Limbs start at about 35 feet. And then to the north of that, there are some 35-year-old Doug firs, limbs starting at probably about 25 feet. And then recently somebody bought the house to the north of us and put in a 6-foot chain link black fence. So what we'd like to do is plant some kind of lower light hedge there to block out the fence that would be, say, 8 or more feet tall. So do you have any recommendations on plantings in that environment that would hide the fence and would be a nice natural area for the birds and butterflies and insects?
Well, if it's shady like that, and you want to go with non-natives, there's all kinds of broadleaf shrubs that you could plant there. But if you want to stay with the native plant theme, tall Oregon grape would be the right size, and it spreads by roots. And it's great for pollinators. But if it's too shady, it may not do well. If it's bright shade, it might be okay. And it would be cover too. It would give cover for birds.
Okay. And that would grow to about what height?
Oh, about 8 feet.
Oh, that'd be great. And is it fairly dense?
It's the tall Oregon grape. Well, it's more dense if it gets more sun, and it thins out if it's very shady. So it might depend on the light level, and you might be able to prune it some to influence that.
You're looking for something that will cover a fence in some shade.
Yes.
Well, the first thing I would also recommend is Holodiscus discolor ocean spray. It is fairly shade tolerant, it's fairly dense. And so I think that would be one good choice for that.
It grows to about what height?
Oh, 10 feet.
10 feet.
It is deciduous, though, if you're looking for something evergreen.
I would prefer evergreen.
Dan, you might want to consider Western red cedar and either top them or get a cultivar that doesn't grow very high. Because Western red cedar isn't going to give you any nectar value, but where do you live?
The south end of Mercer Island.
So you could easily, get cedar hair streaks there on your Western red cedar, plus some cool moths. So it's got real value and it makes it an awfully good screen, grows pretty fast.
It had in the, I'd say, spring through early fall, it has good filtered light coming through that big leaf maple. Probably for about 6 hours during the day.
Go Western red cedar and get Julie's orange native honeysuckles growing on it.
Oh, is that right?
Well, you could do that.
You can put them on the trunk.
Why not?
Well, 6 to
Well,
8
now
hours
hold
a
on a
day,
minute,
you're
'cause
all
I've-
day.
I've done that. That's why I have them scattered all over the garden. And I have a paper birch out there that's pretty tall, and there's a huge Lonicera ciliosa, the Western trumpet honeysuckle, and it's 30 feet up in this tree.
Oh.
Every few years, we have to get a ladder out and climb up there and actually cut the vine, because as the trunk of the birch gets bigger, it starts to get strangled, I guess, by the vine. I mean, it's just getting, so you have to be careful if you do that. You can do that. And I love how it is because the vine is so high up in the tree. But it'd be great if your neighbor let you put that vine on the fence.
Yeah.
Oh, that would be good.
Yeah, I don't think they'd care. So that's the Western trumpeter.
Western trumpet honeysuckle.
Okay.
Maybe I'll put let me type it in, the scientific name. Okay.
Okay, and Reg, I see you're still on. Why don't you unmute and ask your question of Julie?
Okay, thank you.
Reg?
Okay, it took me a while to find the button. Sorry.
Okay, great.
So we have Buttercup taking over the yard, the flower beds. It's marching across the lawn. And quite frankly, I'm afraid to get in front of it. I'm just wondering if there's any moderately easy fixes. We're not going to spray chemicals on it, but it's going to take a concerted effort if we do it brute force.
Is it growing with anything else like lawn that you're trying to protect, or can you mulch the whole thing and just get rid of that whole situation?
It's growing. It's growing in with our attempt to put native plants out, and even
Okay.
pseudo native plants. We don't love the lawn, but on the other hand, I don't want to be replanting.
Yeah. Well, two things. So here at home, if it's shady, that weakens the buttercup, and I've been able to dig it up. So if you've got things that are going to shade that in time, that will make it easier. But in the meantime, and I haven't used this here at the house, but I've used it in some of the public pollinator gardens that I've worked on, as just wood chips, really thick. Get a free load. Chipdrop.com is free wood chips, and you do have to wheelbarrow them in, or you could hire somebody to do it, to smother and weaken at least, so you can dig out what remains of the buttercup.
I find almost nothing but weeds grow in wood chips.
What'd you say, Stuart?
I find almost nothing but weeds grow in wood chips.
Oh, yeah.
You have to pile them deeper. They have to be 6 inches deep to kill things underneath them, except my tulips still come up through them even when they're pretty deep. But yeah, they will, if you pile them deep enough, you will at least weaken the buttercup. I spray it myself, cut to the chase.
Well, I don't spray anything, but I'd almost be tempted to, if I did, if I was a spraying man, I'd spray that and I'd spray the Lamium galabdulon too. It's that creeping buttercup, it's very pretty, but it's got very, very little wildlife value. I suppose where it's native, it must have, but here in 40 years, I've only ever seen, I've seen woodland skipper nectar on it a couple of times, but rarely. And I once saw an ochre ringlet nectaring on it. In fact, a number of them in one place. You know how one butterfly will just settle into a particular plant and use it. Then you never see it use it anywhere else. So it can be used. And then bees use, some kinds of bees do use it. It's not totally without value as a pollinator plant, but it's pretty useless and pretty darn hard to get rid of too. Tia just always dug them up one by one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I do. I just dig them up. But if you
Okay.
have too many, that can be pretty daunting. So,
Yeah.
On the other hand, the native buttercup, which we have abundantly in our hay fields down here in Southwest Washington, which is very nice that this native plant has survived in our pastures in Whatcom County. Ranunculus occidentalis, isn't that right?
That's correct.
Stuart?
It's correct that it's Ranunculus occidentalis,
That's
Western buttercup.
Yeah, that's a wonderful plant, and it's actually a pretty good nectar plant too. But we don't get them in our yards.
Okay, thank you, guys.
Okay, any other comments, questions? Anybody have something to say?
Well, just this, Julie, I'd like your thoughts. You're such a master of this. Tia and I admired you and your gardening for decades, and I'm so happy that you bring this to us. Your collective wisdom in that beautiful, beautiful place at Brier that you've made for you and your family and your neighbors. But you know, nobody has mentioned the forbidden BB word tonight, butterfly bush. Obviously not native here, although there's a native species in Mexico, believe it or not, that has an endemic obligate species of checker spot on it, a really cool one. And yet, many of us in our deepest, quietest corners will admit that there's still nothing like it for attracting things. I'll be very honest. What I've learned here in 40 years about butterflies, I probably wouldn't know a tenth of it without butterfly bush, because it is simply the frogging magnet. Now, anymore, I tell people,
It's a magnet for you.
yeah,
I've been monitoring a butterfly bush every bicycle ride to and from Lincoln Park where I'm at for years. And I'll get 5 butterflies on 10 bushes in a year.
yeah,
So
yeah.
your area has, and it's a nasty weed.
Everything
So
comes
your
to it.
area is getting butterflies, so maybe like I caught them on Long Island as a kid.
Yeah,
But I don't see very many butterflies at all on our butterfly bush in Seattle.
well, that's a good thing, really, if it were that way. And I no longer recommend it to people, of course, unless they're going with the non-native species. And as we learned in an earlier meeting recently, there is a research group at OSU that's working on the sterile cultivars, trying to see if they work also. But I guess my question, Julie, is clearly if we have a dangerous, I'll say it, invasive weed such as Buddleia is on the Skagit, on the Duwamish, on the Dosi, on the duck, you know, the butterfly bush is not to be countenanced anywhere near our native habitats anymore. We all know that. And I certainly wouldn't recommend people planting it. But when you have a resource, say for your hummingbirds, that works really, really well, do you just kind of keep that to yourself and use it? Or do you actually recommend it to people, even if it's going to broaden their view of what's acceptable? I'm not sure.
Well, I have removed, back in the old days, I tried butterfly bush because, it was 34 years ago when we moved here. And so I wasn't as knowledgeable about the problems with it back then. And I
Right.
grew it, but I've removed it. I've removed it. So, but a
Good for you.
different example, I'm going to share with you my very favorite noxious weed. And it is the hardest thing for me to remove. And it is purple loosestrife.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. It grows in wetlands and pollinators love it.
Yep.
And it showed up in my little drainage ditch by the street, and I knew I had to make myself remove it. And I did, because it's such a threat to wetlands, but it's hard to do that.
Well, Judy, if it's any consolation, David James and I have had to lobby the state and the counties and the weed districts in several areas not to remove the purple loosestrife, because it turns out to be probably the single most important migratory fuel for monarchs in Washington state.
Okay. That makes me want to grow, but I'm going to stay out of it because I live here and we don't have monarchs, and we don't have a lot of it established anywhere. So I'm talking about finding one plant in my ditch, and it's like, oh, I know this is beautiful, but I also want to just yell at everybody that I put in the chat box, WNPS.org for April is Native Plant Appreciation Month. And there are some great programs. And there's one on Gary Oaks that will take place on April 18th. And I forgot to mention that when we were talking about oaks. So it's in the chat box. Check it out. There's a lot going on there in the next month or two.
I'd like to comment on the buddleia. When I first started my butterfly garden, I got some plants, and they were in my garden for about 20 years. And I think I had one seedling in that time and none in the neighbors' yards. And yet I have seen it come up like grass in a driveway. So, I'm not sure what the issue was with my yard, but it was fine. The other is that I'm growing Buddleia exwiriana, which is a yellow flowered, it's probably crossed with Buddleia globosa. And that one is not seeding, and it starts blooming late, about maybe June, and it blooms all the way into the last frost of the fall. And it's being utilized by the bees, the birds, if there's any butterflies in the area, they do stop by, but I can't say that Montlake Terrace is a haven for butterflies yet. Got a long way to go there. The other one I'll add is milkweed. I got some nice speciosa in Eastern Washington. It grows in little clumps about knee high. Mine get 5 feet tall, and they're running all over the yard. So these things have their ways, and they exploit the environment. And if they're happy, they just continue to exploit. I'm going to have to figure out a way to keep them out of my path. So I would recommend Buddleia exwiriana, it's called. I don't know about Buddleia globosa. They have Buddleia globosa in the parking lot at the Arboretum Graham Center. So you can look at it there.
How does it spread?
It doesn't spread. Mine hasn't spread. There've been no seedlings. And it hasn't runnered. It's gone up to 12 feet and it's getting very wide. So I'm going to have to use the usual thing is to cut them way back now and let them come all back up fresh. And they do bloom better that way.
They spread by seed, and the seeds prefer to germinate in disturbed gravelly soils, which is why there's such a problem in riparian areas. And that's a lot of why people don't see seedlings in their yards. There's a bunch of big buddleias in my neighborhood. And when the city came through and repaved the road, there's a nice freshly disturbed gravel shoulder, and it was full of buddleia seedlings after that.
And when you deadhead them, you've got to deadhead them pretty early. They
Yeah.
put out the bulk of their seeds in October and November, but they can start in September. And they're tiny seeds and there's a lot of them. So even though I have not got rid of them, just because almost everything that comes here comes to that.
That's David I. Is that David I?
Estividia, yeah.
Yeah.
But I check my river. Every year I watch the fields between me and the river. I watch the river and I haven't seen any spread here. And I certainly hope I won't be a vector for that. Sometime I should just get rid of them, but I'm not quite ready yet. But I certainly don't push them.
I read an article about getting rid of Buddleia, and they said that you had to get rid of it because it was a plant that would grow where nothing else would. And I thought maybe that's an argument for letting it grow.
Well, as a matter of fact, one of the things that I was most taken by the year I got to study butterfly conservation in Britain in 71, 72, that the Xerces Society came out of that experience. And I was learning from everybody I possibly could all over the British Isles. And I went to one meeting at Liverpool Polytechnic of all places. And the one fact I remember from that conference on it was some conference on conservation was the fact that in trying to revegetate the coal slurries in Wales and Northern England, these horrible landscapes of heavy metal rich coal slurry, left over from the old coal mines. You may remember the story of the one that became saturated and slumped down onto a school back in the 50s. That was a terrible thing. So they're trying to revegetate these Mordor-like landscapes. And they found two plants that do really, really well on the old coal slag. And one of them was a native. It was Urtica. I think it's the same species, Dioica, but it was stinging nettles. And the other one was Buddleia davidii. And so they found that they were getting these two species demicultures or duocultures over these vast areas of coal slags of Urtica and Buddleia. And of course, the Urtica is the host plant there, same as here, for the comma butterfly, they call it. It's like our Satyr angling, and the red admirable, and also the small tortoiseshell, just as it is for those three nearby species here. And the Buddleia is their favorite nectar plant. So they had this one-stop shopping, very, very watchable butterfly habitats all over these old slag heaps because those two plants would grow there.
But you want to keep in mind around here, you say maybe it's a good thing this Buddleia grows where nothing else will. That is not a good thing in salmon streams.
No, it certainly isn't.
It is disrupting salmon habitat by
Very
stabilizing the
much so.
reservoirs.
Yeah, really bad on the Skagit, really bad on the
Dungeness.
Dungeness, I'm trying to say, yeah.
Virginia, do you want to comment on toadflax as well?
Comment on what?
Toadflax.
Oh, toadflax. Yeah, depending on where you are, it's probably not going to spread really badly in Western Washington because it's not the right climate for it. But yeah, it's something that can form big monocultures and maybe probably not butterflies, maybe some bees would be able to use the flowers, but you've got to ask yourself, what other plants is it excluding in the process?
What's the toadflax? What's the scientific name of toadflax? I don't know what it is.
Linaria?
Huh?
Linaria.
Linaria, thank you.
Yeah, there's a couple of different ones that are weedy invasives.
Yeah, Linaria purpurea and Linaria, I'm forgetting the yellow.
Dalmatica, I think.
That's another one.
Yeah.
Karen, do you want to unmute and join the conversation?
Me?
Karen first.
Yes,
Karen.
hi everybody. This has been great. Yeah, I live in Mount Vernon and I've been planting native gardens in my house since I moved in 2017. And last year, this toadflax, it's beautiful and it's pink and it showed up in my yard and I didn't know what it was. And so I let it just grow for the season and it was this wonderful bee plant. it was covered in bees. And so then I found out, somebody told me that it was noxious and I should get rid of it immediately. But every time I search online, it says the yellow one, the Dalmatian one, is the noxious weed. So I was just curious as to what you guys would do based on some of the conversations that some plants can be okay if they're not native, because if they're an excellent bee plant, and this is.
I don't know of a pink one, so that's something different.
It's beautiful. It's just.
It may be a different species that is not one of the ones we know of as a weed. I don't know of a pink one, so that's interesting.
I don't know where it came from.
The purple toad flax starts out, you have purple, and then there seem to be some that sport to get to pink. They have the same growth habit, the same foliage and everything. And the bees love it. They will pass everything up and find the next toad flax. And they go up and down and they hit every flower. They come back and they go for it. And maybe why it's so successful, and actually maybe why so many of the good nectar plants are so successful, is that the bees come and so they get good seed production. But I keep it in the garden right now. I haven't known of it being an issue, but maybe I need to check into that.
So Julie, you mentioned an option for sending photographs or posting things, a native plant. Can you review that again? And maybe that would be helpful for Karen.
Well, I don't think the Linaria is native, so that wouldn't work for that one. But
Okay.
Yeah, if you have a photo that you can share with someone, if you go to a nursery, say, or a master gardener's workshop, somebody might be able to identify it.
I have to mention iNaturalist. If I'm not at the park pulling weeds and trying to help the native plants grow back, I'm on iNaturalist helping people identify their plants, animals, and fungi. So if you join iNaturalist, you can post your photos of any plant, animal, or fungus. Actually, they prefer that they be wild, not garden planted things. And people like myself can help identify them. If you were to tag me, I would then offer to identify it.
Yeah, that's great. I'm on iNaturalist. I use it all the time. I love all the brilliant people on there.
So if it's garden plant that's not native, well, Sharon, she knows more about this than I do, but there are master gardener clinics and there are people that should be able to help ID it.
Well, it's Linaria purpurea. I'm just not sure if the pink is a sport or if it's a true species. It looks exactly like the purple one. And the pink one doesn't show up very often. So of course it makes it more, oh, I've got a pink one.
Sharon, when you said it's a magnet for bees, were you speaking of mostly of honeybees or of native bees as well?
Bumblebees.
Bumblebees.
Bumblebees. I grow mullein, which I know is a noxious weed, because it gets a very cool little weevil, and the honeybees will go up and down the mullein and hit every flower. They don't do the toad flax. The bumblebees do the toad flax. And one of the things I hope to do in future years after I move out of all my storage stuff is sit and watch to see, are there periods? I know some plants will shut off their nectar flow at certain times, and maybe other plants pick up at that time. So it'd be interesting to know when the nectar flows occur on these different plants and how that interacts, how the bees interact with that. They tend to be constant. So if they find a plant, they tend to go back and back to it until it shuts off. That much I've read, but I don't know which plants do that.
May I ask Julie another question?
Sure.
Julie, I'm wondering, how long have you been working on your garden at Brier?
34 years.
Thought it was about that. So I'm wondering if you have kept species lists of visitors to your plants, both birds and insects.
I do. For years, I reported to Pilchuck Audubon Society, my bird sightings, for about 10 or 15 years. And then they weren't really doing anything with it. And I let it go. And then I do keep, I just have, they're a little bit anecdotal. But yes, I have observation lists.
Do you have a sense of how many species of butterflies you've attracted in that time?
Yeah, the top count is about 18, but some of them were one-time sightings,
Yeah,
like,
that's good.
yeah.
That's great.
Mhm.
That's very good around Puget Sound.
But much less now. It's the same as everybody. I don't want to go down a discouraging note, but there's been such a reduction.
Mhm.
Yes, as the gentleman who spoke at the beginning,
Yeah, Darren McRae was talking about that. Very
Daryl,
passionate
yes,
about it. Yeah.
it's very powerful.
Mhm.
Perhaps, Regina, you could ask Daryl to write a little digest of some of his information for GNUM sometime.
That's a good point. He posted a bunch of information and gave me his email. I don't know if he's still online, but I will contact him. And yeah, the information, he's very focused on CO2 levels. And of course, that's extremely important for climate change.
So
All right,
just a
any other-
quickie, just a quickie on buttercup. There's a sawfly that likes it. And I usually find the sawfly on buttercup that's in shade. And bed straw too.
Does the
always
sawfly ever,
something.
does it ever devastate it?
I'm sorry, what?
Does the sawfly ever devastate the buttercup?
No, it's not to their advantage to totally devastate it. I do probably more damage than the sawfly does. It does knock it back quite a bit though.
Well, that's what
I
I
have some
meant.
of that sawfly. I need some of that sawfly. Can you send me some?
You just grow a buttercup, they'll come. Grow
I've
it and they'll
got
come.
buttercup. Nothing touches it.
You have to look. You would notice maybe some shredding of leaves or some feeding on the leaves. Then you have to get down there and look because sawflies match their plant really well. And so it's hard to see them. Even if you know what you're looking for, it's hard
Yeah.
to spot them.
Yeah.
But they're not on my ones that are in the sunny rockery. So
So Sharon, Karen is asking if she can send a picture. Would you be a good person to look at it?
I can look at it. I know quite a few plants. I'm not a taxonomist, so then I forward it to the master gardeners and they usually know.
Well, if you're willing, if you could put your email in the chat function. Otherwise, perhaps Karen could.
Oh, I can do that.
Yeah, otherwise Karen could send it to a
I've been
master gardener.
feeding little notes as thoughts were triggered into the
Yes,
chat.
yes, there's lots of great comments. Thank you so much, Sharon. It's just that there's been so many that I haven't, responded to every comment, but there's been a great conversation just in the chat.
I think we lose a lot when we don't capture the anecdotal stuff.
Yes.
And there's actually a process for bringing people together around a table. And the first person acts as the first recorder and everybody goes to a different table. They talk about the topic of that table, recorder records it. Then everybody goes, the second person comes back to the first table. And it's a way of gathering information in a sort of fast way. And you record all of that and then you can summarize the recordings and report back to the group. I've always wanted to do that with some of our thoughts and anecdotes and nectar observations and pest observations. But
Well,
it takes.
I think you're absolutely right about the anecdotal information. One thing that I really clued in on with Julie's talk was some of the detail, for example, about the fourth floor garden apartment that had the monarch. I mean, that really tells you a lot that you can make a big difference even if you're in a condo on the fourth floor. So I love that, that you include that anecdotal component to your talk, Julie.
Julie, how's the habitat holding up around you? I mean, are there still areas that aren't too far away to be reservoirs of recolonization or where things can come to your place from? Are there some decent habitat greenways or reserves anywhere near you?
Well, that's a really good question because we've been watching a lot of development and a lot of loss of big tracts of forest, and yet there are still some pretty good greenbelt connections, some steep slopes and some riparian corridors that I'm really grateful exist. And so, I'm not certain if it's enough, but it's sure better than none of that. At least we do have some green corridors. But I'm concerned because a lot of it is, I'm in a part of the state that has, or the county, Snohomish County, that has a Growth Management Act, and all the development and new housing is supposed to be concentrated in the particular area where I live. It's not far from Sharon. I'm in Brier. And the problem is I've actually written letters and say, I understand that's the goal is to not have sprawl in the farmland and such, but you're really destroying the quality of life right here where it was pretty nice. And so that's a difficult one. That's a really difficult one. Yeah.
One of the things that I've done, I have a program I give on building a pollinator garden, but I start off with why and some of the headlines, but basically probably my most compelling slide in that is how our cars used to look after a trip anywhere and how they look now. And I've got a grill that is just full of insects that you had to stop and wipe off. And now you don't have to do that. You don't need a headline to tell you that they're decreasing. And then the other is showing a scraped off development area where they take off all this topsoil and then they put in grass and conifers. And Dave Paling came up with a figure, I think it's 22,000 visits to make 1 teaspoon of honey. That's a lot of forage. And when we wipe out that forage, we have to somehow replace it. So my goal is to try to get people to think about ways of returning forage to edges, commercial building, away from the building, but commercial edges, golf course edges. I think there is some effort now to put to restore areas in what they call the non-play areas, the wooded areas where you lose your golf ball. And I also think it would be possible to plant perennials and figure out ways to manage them so they're as easy to manage as a lawn. You just come in and mow down the perennials and then let them regrow and rebloom. I don't know how that would actually work, but there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of land where the flowering power could be restored. So
Sharon, your
who
comment
knows?
about the windscreens brings to mind a very, I think, important and powerful book in this area of the diminution of life around us. It's called The Moth Snowstorm by Michael E. McCarthy. It's a very, very good read, a beautiful read, disturbing for the reasons you talked about, and yet it does offer a lot of ways of response and hope. But the moth snowstorm refers to when he was a boy in England and driving through the countryside, there would be so many moths in your headlights that it looked like a snowstorm. And you don't see the moth snowstorm anymore. But I do recommend that book with the proviso that parts of it are disturbing, but then what isn't?
Yeah.
But also it's got some good positive stuff too.
I think another piece that I put into the lecture is light pollution. A picture of lights with clouds of moths around it, and then a picture of lights from space, showing how much of our land is lit all night long. And that's an issue for insects that are attracted and can't break free.
Yeah.
And migrating birds as well.
Oh, good to know. Yeah.
lights, yeah. It confuses them. Okay, any other questions, comments? We've run way, way, way over time and it's been delightful. And so thank you so much for your willingness to stay and engage with us, Julie. It's been a real pleasure. So thank you very much. And we'll have a program next month in April, and that will be Dr. David James will speak about the Western monarch population. So we have that to look forward to. So thank you very much for joining us. And thank you so much, Julie, for being
Thank
with
you,
us
Julie.
tonight.
Well,
Thank you, Julie.
That was
thanks,
wonderful.
everyone. So good to see you.
Okay, good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Night.
We sh-
Nighty night.